Let's turn today to Matthew's Gospel, chapter 14 and verse 13. In our last study, we were considering how Herod put John the Baptist to death. We read here that in verse 12 that the disciples came and took away the body and buried it, and they went and reported this fact to Jesus. And when Jesus heard it, he withdrew from there in a boat to a lonely place by himself. When the multitudes heard of this, they followed him on foot from the cities. And when he came out, he saw a great multitude and felt compassion for them and healed their sick. We read something here which shows us the humanity of Jesus, how he had emptied himself when he came down to earth of that perfect, complete knowledge of all things that God has, omniscience, that he gave up. He knew about the death of John the Baptist only when the disciples came and reported it to him. God knows everything, but Jesus had emptied himself of that. And when he heard about it, he felt the feelings that we as human beings feel when someone who had been so close and so faithful had finally been martyred. He withdrew to a lonely place by himself, no doubt to be quiet with his Father. But he would not allow the sorrow to take so much of his time. He saw that he had a ministry to fulfill, and he saw a great multitude. We read in verse 14, and felt compassion for them and healed their sick. A lesson for us and an example that even when we face sorrow, we are not to let it overwhelm us so much that we fail to discharge the ministry that our Father has appointed for us. When it was evening, the disciples came to him, saying, "The place is desolate, and the time is already past. So send the multitudes away, that they may go into the villages and buy food for themselves." And Jesus said to them, "They do not need to go away. You give them something to eat." They said, "We have here only 5 loaves and 2 fish. And he said, "Bring them here to me." And ordering the multitude to recline on the grass, he took the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and looking up toward heaven, he blessed the food. And breaking the loaves, he gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave to the multitudes. They all ate and were satisfied, and they picked up what was left over of the broken pieces, 12 full baskets. There were about 5,000 men who ate, aside from women and children. That last verse indicates there probably were about 10,000 people there who were fed, 5,000 men alone. It says, beside women and children. And there are a number of things that we learn here concerning the attitude of Jesus to people who are in any type of need, and that includes material, physical need as well. God is not only interested in our spiritual needs. He's interested in our physical needs, our financial needs, our material needs. He's very much interested in them because he knows that we need these things to live on the earth. He knows that we need food, we need clothing, we need money, we need a house, we need to educate our children. He knows all those things, and he's concerned about them. Jesus taught us to pray, "Give us this day our daily bread." And that's a very spiritual prayer to pray. It's perfectly right to pray to God for our material necessities. It's quite another thing to pray for luxuries or for unnecessary things. And also, Jesus taught us to pray for material things after we had prayed first for the hallowing of his name, the coming of his kingdom, and the fulfilling of his will. So there's nothing wrong in praying for material things, provided it is put in the proper place, next to the kingdom of God and his righteousness. And we see a demonstration of that here, that when the disciples who wanted to pass on the responsibility of feeding them onto the people themselves said, "Send these people to the villages." In another passage it says that these people had been a number of days without food. Quite amazing how so many people followed Jesus to hear his word. And Jesus had compassion on them. "Give them something to eat," he said. And we read from John's Gospel that they brought a little lad who had 5 loaves and 2 fish with him. And it's very interesting to see something here, that Jesus who could have easily created bread from nothing, did not do that. And that is a spiritual lesson for us. The Lord always wants to work in partnership with human beings. He could have evangelized the world without the help of any human beings, but He chooses to use us. He could have blessed others without any human instrumentality, but He always uses a human instrumentality to bless. And that's what we see here. He's using a little lad to bless the multitude. And one can imagine that little lad going home and saying that Jesus and He fed the multitude, and that was true. It was His gift of 5 loaves and 2 fish, which was probably sufficient just for Himself, which enabled Jesus to feed the multitude. Not because He could not have done it without that, but because He wanted to do it with the cooperation of one human being at least. And this is a fundamental principle. You remember in the marriage of Cana, He could have created the wine from nothing, but He asked the servants to fill the water pots of stone with water and turn the water into wine. An act of cooperation. Jesus always works in partnership with us. Take my yoke upon you, we studied in Matthew 11. It's a partnership, a fellowship with Jesus in which we fulfill our ministry. And He doesn't need much. 5 loaves and 2 fish look like an insignificantly small amount of food to feed a great multitude. But that's enough. And that's an encouragement to every one of us, that when you look at the need and you look at your own resources may look pitifully small compared to the need, whatever the need is. Maybe a need in your home, maybe a need in your children, it may be a need in your church, it may be a need in your area, and you look at your own resources and they are so small. If you keep that for yourself, of course you'll only feed yourself. But if you give your all to Jesus, He can feed a multitude. There's another lesson here. It's those who give everything that they have to the Lord who are used by God to bless the multitude. Do you give everything that you have to the Lord, like this little lad? Then He can use it to bless the multitude. There are people who give 10% to God. That was Old Testament. In the New Testament, we're not called to give 10%. We're called to give everything. And when we give everything to the Lord, it's not that our needs are not met. In fact, this boy who gave 5 loaves and 2 fish could have had 10 loaves and 4 fish if he wanted afterwards. He gets back not only what he gave, but more than what he gave, and in addition, the multitudes are fed too. And that's a lesson, that if you give your all to the Lord, you'll find not only your own needs are met, but God can use you to bless the multitudes. And here is where very, very few people give their all. So many people seek their own, even among believers. They're always keeping back for themselves, and that's why God cannot use them to bless the multitudes. And we read here that the disciples took the food and gave it to the multitudes. And there again we learn another lesson, that Jesus did not ask for volunteers. One would think that a more efficient way of distributing the food would be to ask for 500 volunteers, and the job would have been done quicker. But He didn't ask for volunteers. He asked His 12 disciples to feed these 10,000 people. Not the most efficient way of doing it, but the most spiritual way. Because in God's service, there are no volunteers. You cannot volunteer to serve the Lord. You have to be called. If God doesn't call you, you cannot serve Him. You cannot go and bless the multitude just because you want to. You cannot volunteer in saying, well, Lord, here I am. I would like to serve you full time. He may not want you to serve full time, then you better sit down. No, Jesus called His disciples, and only to them did He give the food. And here is the reason for such a lot of shallowness and hollowness in the ministry of the Word today. Many are preaching who have not been called. They have volunteered. We cannot volunteer. Jesus did not ask for volunteers. He gave the food to the disciples, and the disciples gave to the multitudes. And remember, the disciples were hungry too. They had also been without food for a number of days. And one can imagine the disciples thinking, I hope there's something left for us after all these people have eaten. But the Lord took care of them. We read that after everybody was fed, the Lord had made such an abundance, and he asked the disciples to pick up what was remaining. What was remaining doesn't mean the broken bones of the fish and the crumbs of the bread. No, this was fresh bread and fish that had been multiplied in excess of what was needed. Good bread and fish. And they collected 12 baskets, one for each of the disciples to take home. That's how God rewards those who serve him. If we serve him unselfishly and faithfully, you can be sure that there'll be a basket full left for you at the end of your life. None of your needs or your family's needs will ever go wanting when you have served the others unselfishly.